Hi there, I'm your host, John Ivison, and this week my special guest is Thomas D'Aquino, who for 50 years was a key player in the political and economic turbulence that buffeted Canada. First of all in Pierre Trudeau's PMO, and then for 3 decades as the founding CEO of the Business Council of Canada. Hi Tom, you were once described by Peter C. Newman as the most powerful influence on public policy formulation in Canadian history. And you've just released a memoir. I hope the camera can pick this up. It is called Private Power, Public Purpose, that details your adventures in politics, business and the arts. Congratulations. It's an absorbing read. I know that you had some help from the good folks at Penguin Random House, my friends Doug Pepper and Shona Cook. But at the end of the day, you still have to sit down and tap away at the keyboard and put one word after another until it's done. So congratulations.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And incidentally, I always was of the view that Peter Newman's statement about me being in such exalted terms was way, way over the top. And it caused me more grief than good. That I can tell you. Those who say that any publicity is good publicity are dead wrong.
Well, don't tell the viewers that. That's a good reason for them to continue watching. For people who may not be familiar with you and your history, just to give them a potted history of you were born and brought up in Nelson, BC. In your 20s, you found yourself working in Pierre Trudeau's office during his first term. You seem to have mixed feelings about his signature policies, maybe approving of the criminal code reforms that he brought in and his reaction to the October crisis and the Official Languages Act, but being maybe less approving of his handling of the economy and defence and foreign policy. Is that fair?
I think so, John. You've identified, what I would consider his signal contributions. Behind the Official Languages Act, of course, which a lot of people don't realize today because it's a given, but in effect really bringing French Canada and Quebec to the national scene. He and the other 2 wise men who accompanied him. So those were important accomplishments. And the War Measures Act, seen in the context of the convoy and the report of this week, is a telling a chapter in the history of Pierre Trudeau. He was obviously less interested in the economy. He was a man whose central concern was federalism, the Constitution, and it was clear to me when I worked with him that the economy was not number one on his playbook, and also defense policy. When he came to Ottawa, and if you look back into his earlier life, he was not part of that generation that fielded over 1 million men in Europe and helped win that great struggle against fascism. So when he made the decision to pull back from NATO, even though I was much younger at the time, I thought that was a mistake, and I do say that in the book. But overall, he certainly was one of the most consequential prime ministers that we've had, certainly in the post-war period, and I would say probably among all of our prime ministers. And with it is the good, and with it, of course, is parts of it that were disappointing, particularly the role that he took later on when he went way out of his way to try to stymie all the efforts of the Mulroney government to see if we could reach some form of constitutional accommodation.
Right. Well, let's move on through the decades. And in 1977, you were invited to be an advisor to the newly formed National Association of Chief Executives, the Business Council on National Issues, and you urged them that enhancing shareholder value could no longer be the only focus for CEOs. It seems that they clearly agreed with you, because they then made you president and CEO in 1981, and that was a job you held until 2009. So you've played an active role in some of the big public policy challenges that Canada faced at the time. Can you just single out maybe 1 or 2 where you were integrally involved? And let me start with free trade, because I know that you were very involved in that.
Right. And I would say, John, on the being able to bring the business leadership of Canada to this idea that Milton Friedman's "it's all about shareholder primacy," and any CEO that meddles in public policy issues isn't doing his or her job, that was a major shift in policy in Canada. And I like to think, and I say this in the book, that Canada and the Canadian business community played a leadership role in that transition to a new form of capitalism. On free trade, obviously that attracts a major chapter in the book. I would argue it was the single most important policy, economic policy decision of the post-war world. It transformed Canada, not only our enterprises that tended to be very insular, making them accept the fact, even though they were reluctant at first, that we could compete in a North American environment, and it helped to prepare enterprises and workers for a role beyond our borders, which has been slow in coming, but without the free trade agreement, I don't think that that would have happened. And you know, I was burned in effigy, cow dung was dumped on my driveway, I have a file full of the death threats at the time that I received. That election was very corrosive, very divisive. But at the end of the day, I think Canadians made the right decision, and I compliment Brian Mulroney for having the courage to take it on and make it succeed.
I mean, this is a minor example, but I think it just shows the fact that you were at the table and able to influence policy, even in small ways. There was an incident in the book that you mentioned where George W. Bush is at the table. You encourage David Ganong, who had a chocolate business, to bring up the fact that border regulations on the colour of jelly beans were adversely affecting his business. This issue comes up. Bush instructs his people to investigate and to clear it up. And it was a small but resonant sign of the ability to cooperate on bigger issues. I mean, I would imagine that those types of things happened frequently at that time.
Well, you know, and it was great fun. And the example that you used, John, it was amazing because there was the President of the United States, you know, with a Prime Minister and a President on his side, the three representing North America, and George W. Bush sort of looks at his cabinet ministers in the room and he's saying, are you trying to tell me that a lowly jelly bean, that we've been unable to come up with some form of common approach to regulation? He said, get this done, fix it, you know? So as I said, the lowly jelly bean became, The Economist wrote about it, it got press all around the world, but it was an example of being able to convince my friend David Ganong, who thought, you really think that I should be raising the issue of my jelly beans with the President of the United States? And I said, yes, David, do it. It'll have an impact, and it did.
Just on the wider issue of dealing with so many powerful men, I guess they were mainly men at the time, but tell me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine it was mainly men who were used to getting their own way. I mean, you say in the book there was only one member ever resigned over policy differences over the income trust issue, when Jim Flaherty shut down income trusts. How easy was it to get consensus among such big egos?
Well, John, that's an interesting question because, you know, when you're talking about CEOs and leading entrepreneurs, 150, 160 of them, you would have thought that it would be almost like the lead up to the Congress of Vienna. Impossible to get everyone marching to the same drum. But I believe that the engagement in policy issues, which had never happened before, you know, when people were at the table talking about defense policy, when they were engaged in the environment, when they were talking about broader reforms like parliamentary reform, these were issues that were new to them, and they felt empowered by them, and they felt that if governments were listening, this was worth their time. So a lot of hard work, primarily through task forces, which dug deeply into the issues, and where people felt engaged and empowered and felt, you know, one person summed it up beautifully, Ted Newell, who at the time was the chairman of the council and headed up Nova, a major company in the West. And we were just getting ready to appear before a parliamentary committee on constitutional reform. And he looked at me as we were getting ready to be summoned, and he said, Tom, you know, I'm trying to figure out here what a guy who started off life as a nylon salesman is doing here talking about constitutional reform. I think it was an empowering thing that was able to bring them all together. And that consensus was remarkable. For me to be able to say that after having worked over 1,000 CEOs, only one made a special point of saying, I resign on the issue of income trust because I don't believe that the Council defended my interests in the income trust debate is quite remarkable.
Yeah, for sure. So we've kind of rushed through the years, and there was a point to that. There's an aphorism that good judgment comes from experience, which often comes from bad judgment. So speaking to someone with 50 years of experience in the front lines, I'd like to talk about lessons learned. First of all, when it comes to leadership, and then when it comes to Canadian public policy. And you've got a chapter on leadership in the book. You talk about it being lonely at the top, the physical demands being excruciating, the buck really stopping at the leader's desk, and about how power can be transient. And you talk about important elements of leadership: ambition, integrity, humility, knowledge, and empowering others. So I'm interested to ask you, who in your opinion fit the bill? Who had those leadership criteria of all the people that you met?
Well, you know, John, there were, as the book points out, and if you look at the index, there were quite a few people that I profiled. And I don't want to start with Americans, but I only mentioned two because they did have an influence on my life and who I think had set the standard, particularly when we look at the Great Republic today and we see some of the moral failings of leadership, and not to mention the standard bearer of that in Donald Trump. But when I think of someone like David Rockefeller or someone like George Shultz, these were people of great, great character who, in my view, symbolized that element of how important character is in leadership, which I think we've lost to a large extent in the deep divisions in the United States. In Canada, there are many who fitted the bill. I mean, there were people like Peter Lougheed, who certainly was a mentor to me and who stood on principle, and he was able to defend the interests of Alberta, but at the same time, never left any doubt that this man was a great Canadian patriot who had all the elements of the important elements of character. If you look at a Governor General, which I argue the greatest Governor General of my generation, David Johnston, who brought not only good character, but a sense of the importance of ethics and morality, reminding people that empathy, a book that he has just written and is now talking about, that these are important. When it comes to empowering others, there were the most successful CEOs that I name in the book were those who never walked into a room saying, I'm the smartest guy in the room, but who worked very hard at empowering other people. And I found that in my own life, because these were lessons that I learned from an early time. I was fortunate to begin all of this really at quite a young age, and therefore picking up a lot of it, that empowering others and learning to stand on the shoulders of others and not saying it's all me. That's why I was so uncomfortable with what Peter Newman said about me. It was the name of the game. And in Canada, you know, as I said last night at the launch of my book, the reason I chose the title Private Power, Public Purpose is that all of us in one way or another, the John Ivisons of the world and many people around the world are invested with power. The question is, how do you use that power? How do you influence people with that power? And I discovered through the many, many stories that I tell that there are individuals who are dedicated to what Cicero called the highest good, the summum of all goodness. And the story that I try to tell is that there are many people who, in their own way, worked to achieve this and put their that public purposes ahead of advancing their own private purpose.
Moving on to Canadian public policy, you point out that in 1982 the Council tabled a 10-point plan for economic recovery: restraint to bring down inflation, tilt the tax system towards investment, create a climate in support of economic growth, resolve outstanding federal-provincial disputes, reduce barriers to trade within Canada, ease the burden of regulation, reform some institutions of government. I mean, it's a very familiar-sounding list. You note later that readers who have followed the debate on Canadian competitiveness will have concluded that many of the policy issues and proposed solutions are all too familiar. I mean, have we made any progress since 1982?
Well, you know, John, that is the part of, I guess, the central, apart from the overarching theme of leadership, it's that as Canadians, we've been very effective. If you look back, the many policy papers, we've been very effective in writing them, but relatively poor at execution. And the reason the principal reason why I think we've been poor at execution is something that I call our greatest sin of all, our greatest failing is complacency. As a country, we've been repeatedly complacent. Best example, you've mentioned inter-regional barriers to trade. We were arguing about the importance of eliminating those inter-regional barriers to trade back in the late 70s. And today we still have them, despite the fact that Stephen Pulitz, former governor of the Bank of Canada, said that if we were able to do something decisive on that front, we would inject billions of dollars of value into GDP. We've talked about healthcare over and over and over again, as you know, and yet today we have a healthcare that is struggling, some would say actually broken. And going back to something that I referenced in the book and the work that I did as a part of being a commission with the Nurses of Canada, looking at health and health care, over and over again, in every program unimaginable, everything I read, we hear about the solutions, and yet we are still confronted with the failures. Hence this final word from the Roman writer Horace, carpe diem. We have to be better at seizing the challenges and doing something about them. And it's not through any shortage of ideas, not through any shortage of talent. We have all of that. It's just that for one reason or another we haven't. Defense policy, look, we face an existential challenge. When you look at one of the longest coastlines in the world, you look at the massive land that we have to defend, we are in a pathetic situation when it comes to defense policy. At repeated attempts, oh yes, we will reach the 2% target on NATO, and we're at what, 1.2, 1.3? Why are we doing this?
Because this seems to bother you just more than just about any other point, the decline of Canada's voice in the world.
Well, it does. It does, because it's embarrassing. And, we won't get into sending, just several Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And the sorry story behind that is that we don't have many tanks that are truly operational that we could send. Incidentally, in my book, I talk about being the crew commander in a Leopard tank in some military exercises in Western Europe with our troops. And I know what a formidable vehicle it is. I was on the C-1 Leopard tank. That was Leopard 1. Now we're talking about Leopard 2s. But all to say, John, that, look, we still, Canada, in my view, is one of the very best countries in the world. But we have some serious deficiencies, and it's complacency that's killing us. Look, when it comes to, I say in the book, we should be an environmental superpower and an energy superpower. And the way we do that is to make those two symbiotic and leverage that relationship. But again, what do we see in the country today? We see a country divided on all aspects of energy policy and resource policy. Why is that? It's because somehow we are able to do it and get away with it. That's why I say, John, carpe diem.
Carpe diem. Just on the tank anecdote, didn't you almost run somebody down?
Oh yes.
On the tank anecdote.
In the tank. The fellow who was driving the tank was the CEO of the Ford Motor Company of Canada, and I was in the turret. I was the crew commander.
Right.
We were given instructions. We took the tank down the field and then turned it around. And we'd been told by the instructor, don't jam on the brakes because this massive vehicle will stop on a dime. As we were coming back, the CEO of the Ford Motor Company pressed on the accelerator on the brakes, and all the people who were in front of us, including the top generals who were hosting us, all ran for their lives. But then he jammed on the brakes. So it was quite an experience.
Good. So just to close, Tom, our old friend Elian MacDonald seemed to have hit a sensitive nerve when covering your retirement when he referred to the people who own the country socializing with the ones who run it. You say that the elitist label has never sat comfortably with you, yet the photographs in the book show you with multiple prime ministers, fly fishing with George H. Bush, sharing a joke with the King of Sweden. Isn't that kind of hobnobbing really what the job was about?
Well, it's one of those things that you just simply cannot escape. And that is, if you've worked with over 1,000 CEOs and leading entrepreneurs, you cannot deny history. I mean, I'm not one of these people who says, let's cancel history and let's try to tell a different story. That's a whole other area that one day we might talk about. But what I do try, John, and I may not have succeeded, but I do try in the book to say, look, yes, I may have walked with powerful people, but I remind you of what my mother said on the eve, the night before she died. She said to me, Tom, look after the poor. The rich can look after themselves. And that's something she drummed into me from an early age. So when I started off with the Business Council, I had only one goal in mind, and that is to move away from the Friedman principle, that it's only about shareholder value, and to say that the role of enterprise and of capital ultimately must be the betterment of society. Because if we don't do that, we, the powerful, the elites, eventually will be ground into the dustbins of history. We've seen that in revolution after revolution. We saw that in the terrible damage to the world, particularly after the global financial crisis of 2008, where all this massive debt was socialized, put on the shoulders of ordinary people. And that has created distrust in institutions. It's given rise to populism. It certainly fueled the rise of Donald Trump. It fueled the rise of the anti-Brexiteers and others. So only to say that capitalism, if it's going to survive, has to be smart. And one of the ways to be smart, and it's not to be devious in the Niccolo Machiavelli sense of the word, but to say, ultimately, if we do not deliver the goods for the people, whether it's material goods, whether it's an improvement of standards of living, housing, better housing that we don't have, health care that we need, we're all going to be in trouble. And when the ship sinks, we will sink with it.
A good note to end on. Tom, thank you very much. Congratulations again. The book is Private Power, Public Purpose, and if you have an interest in public policy in this country, it's a must-read. Thanks again, Tom.
John, thank you very much indeed, and thanks for having me on your show. Really appreciate it.
Great.